So with that, let's introduce our guest speaker, Raae Wolfram with Microsoft. And as you can see here, we're talking about Phishing and Furious. Phish and Furious. This is going to be a great conversation. I think you folks chose the right theater. Have a great time and take it away.
Thank you so much, Dana. Thanks to everyone for joining us here at our very first Fast and Furious fan club meeting in San Francisco. Who am I? I am a technology professional, been in the space for more than a decade, have taken an incredibly unconventional route here. I've basically done anything just to get to touch cybersecurity directly. We've been an IT system admin, project manager, and now I am a senior product manager at Microsoft, and I work to help build our managed security services org. So it's a pretty huge accomplishment for me. I am a native New Yorker, just a Puerto Rican kid from the Bronx. So to be able to be here and represent is pretty extraordinary stuff. I'm also a mom to a 5-year-old, incredibly precocious, but she keeps me spry. I am a Star Trek fan. I've had brain surgery and then radiation in 2022. So if anything sounds a little bit funky, just blame it on the radiation. And then I also don't drive, which I think is hilarious considering that Fast and Furious is framing the entire presentation. So it's just for me and my irreverent sense of humor, and also Dana, apparently. But yes, I love that. So what are we doing here, and what are we actually going to be talking about? Well, we're going to be working to address the vulnerabilities that are inherent to campaign builders, email campaign builders, marketing platforms like MailChimp, and discuss how they can be exploited for phishing attacks, right? We're going to address some of the aspects like trust manipulation, as well as the scalability of these attacks, and consideration for mitigating these exploits moving forward. And then essentially really want to focus on the practical strategies to understand and combat evolving phishing threats, but some of the most essential basic practices that we should be abiding by cybersecurity practitioners. All right, so as I said a little while earlier, it is all about family, right? So we're going to start at the basics here, because when we talk about email security, this is setting the foundation, right? So we have this trio or trifecta or triumvirate, if you will, of email security protocols, right? And so we can tackle them independently, and they can be considered as distinct protocols, but really their power is unleashed when they are working together in concert, in conjunction, with all three being deployed in an environment. And when we have this trio in effect, we really are not just building our cybersecurity program and bolstering its posture, but we are engineering it with a level, again, not just of fundamental security, but of resilience as well. And so we're going to tackle each one individually, and we have SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, and then we're going to discuss how important it is to have them working in unison with one another. So the first one, that is the ground floor here, that is SPF, which is the Sender Policy Framework. And again, it's really helpful to understand conceptually the landscape that we're operating in, because when we dig into how the email marketing campaign builders are actually how they function and how we're able to leverage them for legitimate business purposes and how we're able to exploit them for malicious intent, it helps to just have the fundamentals down here, right? And so SPF represents the Sender Policy Framework, and that's really going to validate whether an email server can send mail on behalf of a domain. And an analogy that might be helpful here is to think of SPF like an employee directory. Essentially, it's saying these individuals work within this organization and we vouch for them. And essentially how it functions in the email security protocol world is when a mail server receives an email, it checks against the record to verify if the IP address matches the list, right, of the specified IP addresses that are allowed or permitted to send email on behalf of the server. And so this is really going to be protecting against spoofing, right? So, we have a list. It basically confirms who is able to send emails out. And if we have another entity that attempts to send an email out that is not already specified on that list, it's going to fail the check. Right, so they are not allowed. They're not on the RSVP invite list, right? But that's not going to address the integrity of the email content, right? So we want to validate the identity of the sender, and then we want to be able to confirm the integrity, and so that's where DKIM comes into play. But just to close the loop on SPF and like what it represents, there are two options here, two flavors of how to create or specify your SPF record. Essentially, you can have a soft fail or you can have a hard fail. And the soft fail is more permissive, right? And so if there's an email sent from a sender that's not explicitly listed, not on the SPF record, the network or the organization can still allow that email in, and it could specify how it handles it with DMARC. But if there's a hard rejection setting enabled, then it's going to drop the email. And again, there are different ways to handle it, but by and large, it's just not even going to hit the server. And these are the basics. These are the essentials here. So SPF covers the validation of the identity of the sender. And then we have DKIM, and that's where we're going to get into validating the integrity of the content to ensure that it hasn't been tampered with, or it hasn't been compromised in any way. And so really these protocols build on each other, right? So we want SPF enabled to validate the identity, and we also want DKIM enabled to validate the integrity of the email content. And then DMARC brings it all together. DMARC is going to basically outline what we're going to do. So first, it's dependent on SPF and DKIM being enabled and operational. But essentially, if there's an email that fails the check, we're going to be able to tell it what to do with that email. And then we're going to have reporting, auditing logs, essentially, of what's actually happening. And that's going to be vital to your SOC and your internal organization to understand exactly all of the traffic and activity and to be able to get ahead of threats. So when we think about how this ties into the picture of leveraging a tool like MailChimp, it is a saga in 4 parts, okay? So MailChimp is basically a glorified, or not, there are email campaign building tools like MailChimp, essentially a glorified content builder, and you can blast emails at scale. You can distribute them at scale. The first step in this attack, essentially, is to have domain credentials already, right? And so that's seemingly a non-trivial aspect of this, but we can have insider threats, we can have bad actors, we can have credentials that simply have not been expired because these organizations don't follow, again, the fundamentals of security operations here. So as long as you have access to an active account within that domain, you are good to go. So that's step 1. And then step 2, you're going to set up your campaign builder account, and that is pretty straightforward. And you can essentially load it with fictitious information, with the exception of validating that legitimate domain email address. And then you're going to craft your campaign or your email, and then you're going to wreak havoc, cause some mayhem, and this is scarily easy to do. So again, this is an attack in 4 parts. In the first part, as long as you have access to an active email account within that domain, you're off to the races. All right. So when I first put this presentation together, first started working on the project, I was using MailChimp, and it was a lot more permissive. I was able to build more elaborate HTML campaigns, again, using an outdated email account for a specific domain. Still had credentials that were in no way administrative. I had no admin level privileges, just an ordinary, essentially, student account. And I was able to create really polished looking phishing campaigns, simulated phishing campaigns. Again, there were no special privileges associated with this account. So that was a great, wonderful presentation concept. And when I revisited a few weeks later, it looked like this capability was deprecated. It was addressed. So MailChimp, in response to an industry initiative led by Google and Yahoo that now requires services that send out, or organizations that send out emails, at least 5,000, I believe, a day or for some specific period. It requires them to have DMARC enabled, again, which requires in turn SPF to be enabled in the environment, as well as DKIM enabled in the environment. And so because of this brave new world, MailChimp restricted the ability to basically arbitrarily set the sender, and you're no longer allowed or permitted within the system to send HTML campaigns because of this DMARC movement here, which is pretty impressive. However, we are still able to send emails, again, as long as you create the account in this campaign builder with a validated, legitimate email address, like, John Smith at wherever.com. We can create an email that is plain text and list the sender, legitimate sender, quote unquote legitimate sender, with help support at whatever.com, or IT system team at whatever.com, or financial services at whatever.com. So there's still a major gap here, and that's where we kind of dug in and exploited. And so we might be thinking, how is this really effective, right? Like HTML, email seems a bit more compelling. Folks might be more liable to click around, or might be more easily deceived with a polished HTML email. But with plain text, many organizations use that to send broadcast messages, critical alerts, important time-sensitive information. So this is still super relevant, and it's still a vulnerability here. And so what we're looking at on this slide is essentially setting up the plain text phishing email. So I registered with essentially John Smith at school.edu, And I'm able, again, so it's, we can change the name, right? Like the plain text name. And that's helpful, right? That adds to legitimacy, believability. And we can, instead of the name that you registered the account with, we can alter that, modify it to University Help Desk. We can also modify it to the Bursar. We can modify it. And again, this is sticking to the world of education. We can take a step back and literally select any industry. We can select a healthcare, hospital provider. We can select financial services. So we can get pretty creative here. And then when we alter the email address, again, the email address itself doesn't even have to be legitimate, doesn't even have to exist. We're able to send successful messages with chaos at that university.edu. So, I mean, there are no limits to how creative you can get here. And so what was even, I think, the piece de resistance of putting together this plain text campaign, you have to appreciate that when they properly addressed the HTML vulnerability, I feel, and they implemented that technical control where now you need to validate the actual sender that you are specifying, which is amazing and impressive, and that's totally what should happen. When you set up or create a plain text email and you drop in a URL, and the URL could be anything. It could link to a Rickrolling YouTube video. And the URL is plain text, right? You can shorten the URL. It doesn't matter. If you drop that in to the email itself as you're creating it within this platform, the platform will alter it on your behalf, and it will prepend that domain that you listed, the domain that you registered with. It'll prepend that to the beginning of a vanity URL. So not only does the end user receive an email or a message from this entity that you are impersonating, that you are spoofing, you can also drop in links, and regardless of how those links are constructed, they will appear as they are legitimate and a part of that domain. Now, for this slide, for this screen capture, this is a view where you see the email on desktop. And so kind of appended to the sender, it has via MailChimp or via the campaign builder. Now that's kind of a red flag, that's kind of a signal. More savvy end users might disregard it, might report it. Hopefully they'll report it. But it's not as obvious, right? And it's especially not as obvious on mobile. On mobile, this is pristine, this is seamless, it comes through flawlessly. We have the impersonated identity, we have the modified kind of vanity title and the from name, we have the transform or converted URL that in this case, thankfully, just links to a Rickrolling video. But this appears to be part of an actual legitimate domain subpage. So this is the exploit in the world of the platform. This is what you can do leveraging that tool. Again, with plain text. It is no longer a capability with the HTML module that they have, because they implemented a technical control, because of the DMARC push and initiative earlier in 2024. And so we reached out to the service and let them know, hey, we recognize that there used to be a way to exploit the tool for HTML campaigns. It's still active for plain text. Please create parity, please address it. And we tried to raise it as a vulnerability. It was closed because it was out of scope, because it wasn't technical in terms of the code infrastructure for the platform. And then we reached out to the service support folks, and they share that this is a burden that lies upon the shoulders of the individual organization. They addressed the HTML campaign builder functionality because of the DMARC push, but the plain text feature falls outside of scope in some way, and again, is just the responsibility of the individual organization. And so, this brings us to asking more critical questions here, and thinking, like, we can appreciate that there are some fundamentals and basics to implement when it comes to email security, right? We just want to understand, like, do you have, how conservative is your SPF record? Like, what configurations or what settings or controls are you deploying to that end? And then are you actually leveraging DMARC, right? I totally get that SPF is more straightforward, right? It's a modification of a text record, whereas DMARC, first you have to have SPF in place, then you have to have DKIM in place, and that is a bit more technologically involved. But DMARC is really going to be one of the hallmarks here of your email security program. And so they totally understand that. That's on the burden of the organization. But when we look at the examples set forth by leaders in the space, when we look at the actual impact, where something like if Google and Yahoo say, hey, you can't use our services, right, unless you have DMARC enabled in your environment, I mean, the businesses take notice of that. They're going to pay heed to it. I mean, and obviously, there are other considerations in place there, but it ties into this aspect of just good, upstanding cyber citizenship, right? There's a global community. So we go back to Dom and the theme at hand. It's all about family. And there's an aspect of shared responsibility, right, on the individual organizations, but also the services themselves. So, there are vendor solutions that could be leveraged, but there are leaders in the space and then the vendors that leverage those services. I mean, we work in unison with one another, right? And so just understanding and paying heed to that, I think, is incredibly important and critical to keep top of mind when we consider just how impactful something like leveraging, exploiting a legitimate tool such as MailChimp could go awry, right? So that's where we're at today. Any questions, feedback here?
We actually do have a question.
Yes.
One person asked, do you see these dark patterns being used by semi-legitimate senders? For example, political campaigns and advertisers who don't want to respect email etiquette.
Yeah, I think that is actually a serious concern, which is why we are doing the good work internally. I can speak to my team leading the charge. Again, not in particular to the presentation here, but what I just shared is an actual gap in something that organizations need to think critically about. And so there are simple things that we can do on the technical end. I used to, work for a smaller organization. I understand the challenges and the bureaucracy and the burnout and having to wear many hats all at once. And reconciling the business needs of leveraging these email campaign builders, but also protecting your end users, protecting your organization. It sometimes requires some level of creativity, but sometimes, end user education can go a long way. We can implement some flags or banners as signals or cues to our end users to kind of mitigate the threat and the risk there to a certain extent. So to your question, yes, I think it's a legitimate cause for concern, and there are ways that we can be empowered and show up at the individual organizational level, and also encourage service providers to do their part as well.
Thank you. Another person has asked, if the sender does not exceed the 5,000 message quota, can spoofed email be received in Google or Yahoo inboxes without requiring proper DMARC records?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I can't speak to the ins and outs of the Google and Yahoo service setup, but with regards to MailChimp in particular, they implemented a technical control. So regardless of whether there's a DMARC set up, you cannot send or exploit the HTML campaign functionality without validating first the sender that you are specifying, right? So if you register your account with johnsmith@whatever.com, if you then attempt to send an email with not johnsmith@whatever.com, MailChimp is going to require you to say, oh, cool, you're not John Smith? Fantastic. Please confirm that, right? And they're using multi-factor authentication as well. So it's pretty incredible that for one module, one functionality, one feature, they have really, they shorten up the gaps there. But for another functionality like plain text, that's still the Wild West, essentially.
Well, let me take one last question for you.
Yeah.
Cyan asks, what are some theories as to why plain text is permitted, but not HTML-rich email for the recent DMARC requirements? Like phishing is still very possible.
Yeah, that's a great question. I imagine it's because at first glance, it may be because plain text is not as compelling, right?
Makes sense, yeah.
So it's not as sophisticated, not as polished, but many organizations, for various reasons, still rely on plain text communications. And almost it's a riskier vector because you're going to be leveraging it in the break glass scenarios, in those edge cases, in the, hey, this is time sensitive, this is urgent. You're going to want to leverage plain text over glossy banner and multi-column email content. So I think it's a huge gap there, needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Folks, give it up for Raae.
Thank you.